Hi, my name is Salara Ali, and I'm from New York City, and I'm a freshman at Colby, and I'm double majoring in environmental policy, science, technology, and society. And here I am honored to welcome today's speaker, Tyler Austin Harper, who is a literary scholar whose work blends history, science, philosophy, and environmental studies in exciting ways. Harper's work connects those old debates with today's big concerns, like the threats posed by AI, nuclear war, and climate change. Harper is an environmental science professor at Bates. We won't hold that against you. Harper has published in academic journals like Modern Language Quarterly and Science Fiction Studies, and writes for the public as a contributing writer at The Atlantic, with work in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. Harper's work spans a wide range of topics, making complex ideas about human survival, technology, and society more accessible while sparking critical discussions. Today, he's here to explore how billionaires wield their wealth and power to shape politics and whether they should concern us at all. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Allison B.A., an attorney and executive director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs, and Jocelyn Guel, Colby student, class of 25.
So thank you, Salar. Thank you, Tyler, for being with us. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Jocelyn, excited to be on the stage with you. So as we were just talking before we started the evening, you told me that you started your day at 8 a.m. teaching a class on human extinction.
This is true, yes.
Okay, so let's try to lift up the mood a little bit for the rest of the conversation, although we do have some heavy
That should be
topics.
pretty easy, yeah.
Okay, all right, so we have been talking a lot about, money, actually, the last couple weeks at this series, and the impact of money in politics. And so what I'd love to know is, there's a lot of talk about the impact of billionaires in Trump's campaign, but you've also talked about the huge impact of money in the Democratic Party. And I think we could extend it even sort of broader. We see increasingly billionaires, millionaires owning media, right? Washington Post, even The Atlantic that you write for. We also see it in the courts now. We have a rise of elected judges. We see there's been some controversy over the relationship between Supreme Court justices and very wealthy donors. And so I think my question to start us off is with this sort of extreme wealth and its role in politics right now is, can our democracy actually exist with that kind of influence of money?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, the short answer seems to be no, and I think the evidence for that is that our democracy is not functioning very well at this particular point in time. I think trust in democratic institutions are all-time lows is very well documented, and it's not just the influence of billionaires on the Republican Party. I think that is the most obvious in the figure of Elon Musk and other sort of tech billionaires, who have flocked to his orbit, but it's also true in the Democratic Party. I think the best test case for this is the Harris campaign. If you look at the trajectory of the Harris campaign over the course of it, short-lived as it was, she came out of the gate talking about price gouging and grocery prices and using sort of anti-elite talking points, and that was picking up on some of the populist economic rhetoric that we had seen from the Biden campaign. And over the course of that campaign, partly because of donor pressure, donors who were upset about the sort of anti-elite rhetoric coming from her campaign, partly the influence of Tony West, who was her brother-in-law and who was an executive at Uber, who really pushed her to move off that rhetoric. She embraced messaging around issues related to democracy and fascism and so on that her own focus groups found were much less effective messaging, much less popular than her economic populist messaging. But, it made the donors unhappy, and so she made the pivot, and we are where we are today. So, I think it's both parties. It has a really corrosive influence, and it means that our institutions and our political parties are pretty unresponsive to the needs and demands of everyday Americans.
And does it totally corrupt the media as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not just it's a practical problem as well, that the media is so influenced by billionaires, but it's not just in terms of what is coverage, it's also who tends to work in newsrooms, who gets to work as journalists. If you look at elite outlets, they are mainly staffed by people who come from the upper tiers of American society, who are shot out of elite institutions like this one, or places like Harvard and Yale that come from overwhelmingly economically privileged backgrounds. And that impacts the reporting, because these are not exactly people who are in touch with what the working class wants or needs. And so that also skews the journalism that we get as well and leads to ridiculous articles suggesting that Tim Walz or someone like Doug Emhoff are going to have appeal to working class rural men, right? And you can only think that if you have never talked to a working class rural man. And part of the problem is those kind of folks aren't in American newsrooms. And so I think it's a problem in terms of what gets covered. We're seeing that with Jeff Bezos today, saying that the Washington Post opinion section is only going to cover markets and freedom issues, but it's also in terms of who works in these places and what do they like to cover and talk about.
Great. Well, we'll get back to rural voters because I know that you and Professor Jacobs have had some conversations
Yeah,
about
long
that.
ones, yeah.
But I want to bring Jocelyn into the conversation.
Yeah, so in your article, Is This How Democrats Win Back the Working Class? You discuss the disconnect between the Democratic Party and working class voters. What specific steps do you believe the party should take to rebuild trust and appeal to this demographic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you look at every presidential election since 2008, the candidate who has paid lip service to populist rhetoric on the economy, who has run on anti-war sentiment has won the election. We've seen that every election since 2008. We saw in 2016 with Donald Trump. People forget now because Donald Trump is hanging out with Elon Musk and friends, but in 2016, Donald Trump ran on attacking Wall Street, he ran against the Iraq War, and he ran on this anti-elite rhetoric. And it was mostly fluff. Right? I don't think at the level of policy that Donald Trump is somebody who has populist policies, but he has populist rhetoric. And that rhetoric has won every presidential campaign since 2008. And so, in this most recent election, the Republican Party was able to outflank, I think in substantial ways, Democrats on some of that working class messaging. Again, pretty hollow, but rhetorically they were outflanked, and doubly so on the sort of anti-war, anti-intervention rhetoric. If you follow Donald Trump's campaign for the past 2 years at his rallies and speeches, the two things he hammered were issues pertaining to the working class and anti-war, saying the Democrats wanted to get us into a world war, there's Ukraine, there's conflict in the Middle East, things are spiraling out of control, I'm the party of peace and anti-war. And again, that's pretty hollow, but his base took it seriously. So I think if we want to win back that trust, we need to do what winning presidential tickets have done since 2008, and that is hammer economic populism, and that is make it clear that we are not going to do wanton foreign adventurism abroad, and I think that's a winning recipe.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
So does that mean that, so is it enough for politicians to simply use the rhetoric and then have policies that don't support the rhetoric, or do you have to follow through on the policies?
I think you have to follow through, and I think that's why we've seen this constant flip-flopping back and forth between the two parties over the last several elections, which is that people feel like the party really hasn't delivered for them. I feel like, Biden is a complicated case because there's the issue of age, and there are other things that are circulating there as well. I think, Biden had substantive policies for the working class, had one of the most populist economic agendas, certainly in my adult lifetime. And so, I think Biden delivered on policy, and there was an inability to deliver that messaging for reasons that I think are obvious. But no, I think at the level of winning elections, the rhetoric matters. But I think in terms of holding on to power after that first election, you really need to follow through with policy for sure.
Oh, so I was gonna
pivot a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is on another one of your pieces. Your piece, Billionaires Are the Real Existential Risk, argues that the concentration of wealth among tech magnates poses significant threats. Could you elaborate on how this wealth concentration exacerbates global crises like climate change and AI development?
Yeah, so if you look at something like AI, right, the version of AI isn't one thing, but the model for AI that tech companies have privileged are large language models like ChatGPT, which are extraordinarily resource intensive. And if you talk to these folks, or you listen to their interviews, or you do any digging at all, the way they justify that extraordinarily resource intensive model is by saying, at a certain point, if we scale up and if we feed this thing enough resources and data and give it enough water to cool the machines and so on and so forth, eventually it's going to secrete super intelligence like magic beans, and that super intelligence is going to cure all our problems, including global climate change. So these companies are really explicitly making a wager with the climate that, yes, AI has a lot of negative externalities, but if we just hang in there and play chicken, eventually the machine is going to wake up and it will be super intelligent, and it will figure out clean energy and solve all our problems. That's the explicit wager that's being made by folks like OpenAI and Sam Altman and so on. So this question of wealth accumulation and the role of big tech in Silicon Valley is intimately linked to the global climate crisis, and most disturbingly under the guise of trying to solve it.
I don't know about you all. I feel like in like the last 8 minutes, I've just gotten so much information. I have to figure out where I want to unpack. So you may know, I mean, we have a lot of students who, a very large environmental studies department. We also have the Davis Institute for Artificial Intelligence. I think a lot of our students are really thinking, again, to your very sort of premise of this idea that these are two areas that we can actually make an impact, right? We can. So is there no hope for actually that technological advance or the advocacy around environmental issues? I mean, how do you give us something here. Give us something here that we can hold on to, that there's, I mean, is there some way in which it does actually solve the problems?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at something like cancer imaging, AI is able to detect cancer on scans much earlier than human beings. That is, those abilities and others like them are only going to increase. So there are obviously extraordinarily positive use cases for AI. But at the same time, these companies are also building what amounts to sort of language parrots that are more or less toys to play with and that help us send slightly more efficient emails. And I think there's a question about how do we pump resources into uses of AI that are obviously pro-social and that are solving real problems that go beyond sending a slightly faster email, and how we shift resources away from these other uses that don't really have a positive use case. And that the most successful thing ChatGPT has managed to do so far is to make it easier for college students to cheat and to obviate reading books and writing essays, right? That's not exactly a crowning achievement, So I think a degree of humility from these companies would be great, but also focusing on places where real substantive improvements are possible.
No one in this room.
I believe you.
Turning back to politics for a minute. You had written an article about this sort of question, or this issue of that the Harris campaign didn't really give voters an actual path forward, right? They didn't give them something to believe. They really turned to this, like, that actually Trump was an existential threat,
yes.
right? That our entire democracy, if he was elected, it was game over. That obviously did not move the needle enough to put her in the White House. But you also mentioned in that article that 30% of young folks don't believe who gets elected actually matters. Maybe it was 70. It was a large enough that it got my attention. So is it that the messaging is wrong, or is that increasingly folks don't think that our system works and that it doesn't matter which way they vote?
Yeah, I think people are really nihilistic about our democratic institutions. The Harris campaign made a pivot late in the campaign to focus on democracy and fascism. That is part of a broader trajectory in the Democratic Party of privileging democracy talk ever since the rise of Trump and positioning Democrats as the defenders of institutions. And the problem with that is that many Americans, maybe a majority of Americans, are looking around and they don't feel like those democratic institutions work for them. They don't feel like they are solving their problems. They feel like housing is getting more expensive, medical care is getting more expensive. And those institutions are not responsive to their needs, right? So it is not terribly surprising when many people in this country feel like our democratic institutions aren't working, that a political campaign and a political party that has made defending our institutions and returning to the status quo and getting back to normal or going back to brunch, as Democrats have sometimes liked to say, it's not surprising that messaging hasn't been very effective. But I think another key point of why that messaging has failed both to mobilize young people but also to resonate with voters, the democracy messaging, is that the Democratic Party is, despite the Kool-Aid it likes to drink about the defenders of democracy, isn't actually that democratic. If you look at the last 4 years under Joe Biden, it's pretty clear at this point, was cognitively declining throughout those 4 years. There is ample reporting at this point that his aides and staff members conspired to hide his cognitive decline, that they couldn't schedule meetings after 4 p.m. because they couldn't count on him being fit. Senators and members of his foreign policy team admitted that there were meetings, he had good days and bad days, and there were some days where he couldn't even get through a meeting, right? And they work to hide this from the American public. It is not exactly democratic to have an unelected cabal of staffers and aides running the country around the margins and hiding the fact that our president is unfit, particularly at a moment when we're entangled into serious wars and conflicts overseas, right? So I think a lot of regular voters look at the fact that there wasn't really a substantive primary, and then look at the fact that a lot of members of the Democratic establishment hid Biden's age, tried to do a weekend at Bernie's, and then pivoted to Harris at the last moment. And then look and say, and you guys are lecturing me about the importance of democratic institutions, you guys aren't exactly democratic. So I think, that's part of it too. If, the Democratic Party wants to be the party of democracy, they have to start acting like a party that cares about democracy. The GOP is much worse on this front, but, I think the Democratic Party isn't all there either.
Again, though, I come back to, this happened under Reagan, right? We had right when Reagan was Alzheimer's and in office, and
sure.
the things that came after. So is this moment different, or is this just our current version of parties doing what parties do to try to get elected, to hide information? Or are we really it's something about, like, some of the articles you've written suggest that maybe there is something different right now, right? That the combination of these factors is changing and given that you study extinction, I mean, not that I want to bring us there necessarily, but I mean, so are you feeling like this, like, really is a pivot moment?
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that's unique about this moment is that there is a profound distrust in experts, and there's a distrust in experts because experts have failed on a host of social issues. Going back to the opioid crisis, when our doctors told us that opioids weren't addictive, and then they burnt through half the country. Moving forward to COVID, when we were told that school closures wouldn't impact student learning, and lo and behold, our testing for literacy is dropping off a cliff, right? There are a number of issues where we can say our experts have not really delivered expertise. Looking at the Democratic Party, right? It's supposed to be a well-managed party of political experts, and yet they thought Biden would remain electable despite the fact that 80% of the public in polling said they didn't think he was fit to serve another term, and a majority of Democrats going back 2 years wanted a different candidate in office. So you can look at the sheer incompetence of our technocratic class over the last 10 years, and it's not exactly surprising that the public doesn't trust them. You know, so I do feel like we're in this transition moment because there have been these discrete failures ranging from, the opioid crisis to COVID, going all the way back to the Iraq War. I think, a lot of what we're dealing with is the long shadow of that. So I think this is a really different moment. Obviously, Biden is not the first president to deal with cognitive issues, but I think it is coming at a moment of creating distrust in our experts and in our technocrats, and a lot of that distrust is really well earned.
Yeah, so combining a little bit of everything that we've talked about, what measures do you propose to mitigate the influence of billionaires on public policy and global priorities?
Yeah, I mean, we have to get billionaires out of politics. We have to get money out of politics. That's really an uphill battle. But it can start with pledging not to take money from these mega corporations and PACs that have interests that don't necessarily align with those of everyday voters, right? Bernie Sanders ran a very effective campaign, not taking a great deal of money from these companies. It can be done. I think, the conditions are ripe for somebody that is going to come in and shake up the Democratic Party in 2028. I think, if I had to bet, any of the names that are being circulated right now, whether it's Kamala again or Gavin Newsom, whoever, in 2028, I would imagine that we're going to get somebody who we're not talking about now and who's going to talk about the role of money in politics, and crucially, who has credibility on that issue, because too many of our politicians right now do not, and I think it's going to take somebody who is an outside force, benevolent outside force, unlike the sort of more malevolent outside force like Trump, but I think it's going to take somebody from the outside who can make that credible case to the American people and who isn't so intimately tethered to, these corporate interests. But it's an uphill battle. I don't think it'll be easy.
I'm just curious I think about this a lot. Of your all demographic, how many of you still relate and connect to Bernie's message? So fair number, right? It's I've been told that, Bernie's already passed, but you're suggesting that you still that resonates, whether you supported Bernie or would have supported Bernie or not, but it still resonates. I mean, it's interesting, right? Those populist messages, who can, a very interesting idea to think about who might be here in the next election that we haven't even thought of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's jump into some questions. I want to see, I finally met someone who talks as fast as me. This is fantastic.
I do talk very
This is
fast.
just like my dream. I'm like, how fast can we go?
Yeah.
But we have a couple prepared questions from our small group class. We have some mic runners. I don't know if they're already ready. So I think, where's our first? Nate doesn't have his mic. So we are ahead of it. All right, let's start. Say your
Hi,
name.
I'm Sion. I'm a senior biology
Nice to meet you.
major. Nice to meet you. My question for you is, going back to your work on your PhD, your dissertation on nihilism, how has that shaped your perspective on assessing the roles of billionaires in our society today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my PhD dissertation was on human extinction and nihilism and the relationship between these two ideas, right? A lot of the meaning we derive from the human species and from humanity is predicated on the notion that we're going to continue indefinitely. So the possibility of human extinction is not just a threat to our species, but it's also a threat to how we understand human meaning. I think one of the major problems right now, I think preventing human extinction is the greatest challenge we're going to face in the 21st century. Whether it's threats from from climate change, artificial intelligence, nuclear war, at a moment when tension between global powers is certainly ascendant. I think curbing threats to our species is really the gravest challenge we face in the 21st century. And a major problem is that the people who are taking human extinction and what are called existential risks the most seriously right now are in fact billionaires. I have plenty of issues with Elon Musk. Elon Musk has been taking the issue of existential risk, not just from AI, but from a host of actors, very seriously for the better part of a decade. There are a number of other billionaires who fund research into think tanks at Oxford and Cambridge devoted to these questions of existential risk. How do we go about preventing it? There are complications with that money pipeline that I won't get into here, but my point is the people taking this really seriously are, for the most part, billionaires who are also building bunkers in their spare time in the event that it doesn't all shake out so hot for the human species. But I think it's really important that our political figures take charge of this issue as well, right? It should not be incumbent to billionaires who have a very different set of interests to try to safeguard our species and its future, right? This is something that politicians should be talking about. It should be something that gets asked about on political campaigns because we're entering a very risky century, and I worry that we have underpriced global risk, and I especially worry that we have underpriced risk of nuclear war as the Cold War 2.0 is launching off. I think a lot of people have gotten complacent about nuclear issues. They feel like, this August will be the 80th year anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Something that makes me optimistic, to be cheery, is that, when that bomb was dropped, there were all these newspaper articles that were saying, in a decade, humanity will be extinct because all the other countries will develop nuclear weapons and we can't be trusted with them. And in those 80 years, a nuclear weapon has never been used in combat again. That's a remarkable achievement. And it's a refutation of the pessimists who say that, human species we can't handle technology responsibly. There are instances in which we can. But I think taking those risks seriously again, the flip side of those 80 years is I think we've gotten complacent on a number of issues, including the nuclear issue. And so more people in our educational institutions, in our politics, and not just the billionaire class, need to take these concerns about existential risk seriously.
I think Christian?
Hi, Christian.
Is it on?
Is that on?
Hello?
There we go.
There it is. My name is Christian. So earlier you touched on both the impact that the ultra-wealthy and billionaires have on journalism and the academia. How do you grapple with your personal involvement in both these areas?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's something that makes me really uncomfortable, but I think it's important to talk about it. And I think the influence of wealth on American politics and institutions like this one and on the media, again, isn't just at the level of content, but it is also, and it's not just about the material accumulation of wealth, it's about the culture of wealth that we have in the 21st century is also really problematic. We're in the middle of a second Gilded Age, right? We have concentrations of wealth and economic power that we haven't seen since the age of the robber barons, and by some estimates, there's even more concentrated wealth than that period. Elon Musk makes around $50,000 a minute last time I checked. That is about what the average American, makes in a year. He makes in a minute. I was having a conversation with somebody at Whole Foods, a cashier, a couple of months ago. I asked him what he thought of Jeff Bezos, and he said, one time I looked, and I would have to work every day for longer than the human species has existed in order to make the amount of money that Jeff Bezos has accumulated. That is a staggering fact, right? And obviously, that material piece is important. But to get to answering your question, I also think the culture of wealth is really important as well. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about, both in media, but particularly in academia, is the culture of wealth that we have, which is one that is not oriented toward service. It is not oriented toward civic responsibility. Our elite institutions used to be places that cultivated a dedication to the public service. I would be willing to bet, if I asked folks in this room, I'm guessing a number of you come from wealthy households, probably some of you are seniors, I would be willing to bet that if you went home and told your parents, Mom, Dad, I figured out what I want to do after college, I'm going to officer candidate school and I want to join the Marine Corps. I imagine a number of them would be apoplectic. They would say, we didn't spend $80,000 a year for you to go be a Marine. We didn't, you were throwing your future away, et cetera. I think we have lost sight of how recent that is, right? It used to be the case that elite institutions like this one also furnished civil servants, sent people into the military, sent people into serving the public good. And now if you look at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, about 50% of their graduating classes go on to work in finance or big tech, right? What I want to emphasize is the sheer novelty of that, right? It has not always been this way. If you look at the Vietnam era, look at somebody like Robert Mueller, however you feel about Robert Mueller and his Russia investigation. Robert Mueller came from an extraordinarily wealthy family, was a decorated combat veteran in Vietnam, left the war and joined, had a life in government service, right? And that kind of thing is increasingly rare. So yeah, to answer your question, it absolutely makes me uncomfortable, but I think it's important in these kinds of spaces to have those sorts of conversations about the way not only that wealth impacts who gets to be in this room, but also where they go after they leave, because it's not just the fact of wealth accumulation, but also the culture around wealth today, which is very much oriented against public service, and the idea of what used to be called noblesse oblige has all but been obliterated. I think it's important to talk about that. And so how I deal with that is by trying to be more open about those facts, ugly as they are, and often uncomfortable and hypocritical as it sometimes makes me.
Other questions? Right, do you have a mic over here? Charlie, right? Okay. Can one of you? Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Charlie.
Nice to meet you, Charlie.
In your article, The Emerging Bipartisan Wokeness, you say there is an anti-white and anti-man sentiment sometimes flows freely in academia in ways that would be unacceptable if directed to any other demographic group.
Mm-hmm.
How do you suggest we change our language to maintain the ability to critique these majority groups without being overly pessimistic or pejorative?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? I think it's important to have more sophistication in terms of how we talk about race in America, including how we talk about what gets called whiteness, right? So one of the issues with how this discourse circulates, particularly in higher education, is not that it acknowledges the historical reality of white supremacy or the ongoing effects that structural racism has in American society today. The problem is that there is not a lot of nuance in these discussions. I grew up in a very white part of central Pennsylvania. My dad was a cop. Most of my friends were pretty working class. By the time I was in high school, about 5% of my people I went to high school with had either been in rehab or died from a heroin overdose, right? Those are all white kids. White privilege, as it gets called, is not distributed equally, right? And I think a lot of people in this country hear this talk about whiteness and white privilege, and they are thinking, I don't understand what that has to do with me. I am struggling to make ends meet. My kid is in rehab for the third time, and I'm not exactly having an easy go of it. So the solution is not to say we're never going to talk about race. Race is an enduring fact in American life and has lingering effects that determine who has money and who does not, who gets what job and who does not. All of that matters, and I would never suggest we don't talk about it. But I think we have talked about race in these deeply essentializing ways that largely exist to obscure class, right? When we talk about race, it's often a way of not talking about class issues because, race is something we can do something about, right? We can diversify the elite. We can make sure a demographically appropriate percentage of blacks work at BlackRock Investing, right? That is within our power. It's a lot harder to actually transform American society. And so, I think this shorthand way of talking about issues around toxic masculinity or whiteness is just a flattening, and it's a lack of sophistication, and it's a way of not talking about issues pertaining to class. So I'm not suggesting we drop it. I'm just suggesting we talk about it in more nuanced ways that give space for the variety of human experience and that admit that not everyone who might be white or who might be a man might have benefited from that in some way that is clear and direct,
Great. Just want to make sure up back in the back.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Carter. I'm a global studies government major. I'd like to go back to billionaires and climate change.
Please.
I'm wondering how you think billionaires, mostly oil tycoons and people like that, funding campaigns and other grassroots programs for their own benefit have affected the language around climate change.
Yeah, they've affected it really profoundly. There's a great documentary and book about this called Merchants of Doubt, but one of the really successful things that oil tycoons have done in particular is not refute that climate change is real, but have disputed our certainty about it, right? So the strategy has not been to say, oh, there's no relationship between fossil fuels and climate change. It's to say the science is unsettled, right? Which is why there is this emphasis. So Billionaires has been remarkably effective, not at refuting the reality of climate change, but turning it into an open in question, right? So then there's this sense that, oh, the science isn't settled, right? And there is some trivial sense in which it's true that the science is never settled on any issue, right? Science is a process of open inquiry that never ends, right? But we have very good evidence about the reality of climate change. And partly the reason we feel this way is because billionaires have thrown a lot of money around convincing people that the arguments are not settled. But I think it's also important to note that academic institutions have made themselves a vulnerable target, right? Because we have become very political. Administrations have become far less politically neutral and more outspoken on social issues and current events, right? In ways that make it easier for billionaires to say, why are you trusting the rhetoric coming out of these liberal universities? Why do you trust them when they say, that climate change is a reality? Look at all this other stuff the administration has to say, and look at this other stuff that the faculty has to say. Why would we trust them, right? And there's something that's disingenuous about that, but it's also really easy to understand how a regular person who feels that, for example, conservatives have been really exiled from the academy, and we're not wrong about that, would then say, well, I don't trust these people on these other things, and they seem very political on other things. Why should I trust that the science is neutral, right? So there are real hazards that I think arise when we make academic institutions overtly political, oriented toward activism, et cetera. And one of the challenges is it becomes, we become sitting ducks for billionaire campaigns who, want to say that, scientists are cooking the books in favor of climate change, for whatever reason.
Well, and yet every institution has to make a decision about how they're going to spend their resources, how they're going to invest their time. And so are you suggesting that institutions, academic institutions, should take no positions on any matter?
So generally, I'm a big fan of the Chicago model, which is unless it is an issue directly pertaining to higher education or that in some way impacts the educational mission, I generally think the mission should stay out of it. And partly the reason I think administration should stay out of it is I tend toward the kind of Marxist left, and I think people like me get to exist in academia because historically we've had really robust free speech protections. Sometimes that protects conservatives, but it also protects people like me. And so I think it's important to insist on a separation between the administration and the faculty, right? And the administration and the students, right? The administration used to be able to credibly say, our faculty have free speech, our students have free speech, we are neutrals in administration, so, sometimes we don't like what they say, but, that's on them, we protect their speech. But as that line between faculty and administration, and as it has blurred, as administration has become more overtly political, particularly post-2020, even though that's waning now, it's caused real issues. And so, I do think, I think a lot of people will say everything is political and there's no topic that's not political. That's certainly true, right? But I think, there is a bit of a balancing act, and we've really tipped the scales in the last couple of years in a way that I think has damaged our credibility with the public. I think a lot of people do not see educational institutions in America as speaking to their interests, their concerns, their values, or that give their ideas a fair hearing, right? And I think that's a real problem. So, I'm a big fan of the sort of UChicago approach to all of this. But I would also just, as the last thing, I think it's important, I teach environmental studies, and when I make this point, people will often say, well, climate change is politicized. Are you suggesting we shouldn't fund climate research? And something like climate change, which is a falsifiable, testable thing, is different in kind from questions about, how should we think about tradition and authority? It's a different question in kind than is Adam Smith right or is Marx right? So there's a real, distinction between, issues about which we can have really robust evidence and say something is true or false, and other kinds of issues which are normative ones about values, right? And we need to protect space for a variety of those,
Okay, I've been ignoring the front row, but I'm coming back. Don't you worry. All right. Let me see. We can start. Nate, can you get to Wilson here? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Wilson.
Hi,
So
Wilson.
I see Herbert Crowley's promise of American life as the point of departure for the New Deal, and thus the sort of technocratic odyssey that the left has embarked on the last 100 years. And similarly, the sort of think tank culture starting 75 years ago maybe that started this conservative odyssey in technocracy. But now we see a sort of spiritual rebellion on both sides against technocracy. And so my question is, if both Bernie Sanders and Trump are not the proper sledgehammer to accomplish this rebellion, what is?
That's a great question, and I think in a certain sense, I'm going to sort of take a cop-out and say I think it's a kind of unanswerable one. I don't like this answer. I think I don't want to say that we need a charismatic leader to emerge from the left in order to coalesce a movement around it, but the reality of the situation is I think that's very much what we need. I think we need a Tea Party on the left side of the aisle, a left version of the Tea Party that is going to make a commitment to primary everyone over the age of 60 that's in Congress and say, you guys are getting out of here, you've run our country into the ground and you've destroyed our party's credibility, and make a real case that we need a different Democratic Party that's responsive to the needs of the working people. I'm a practical person, so I don't tend to think that third parties make a great deal of sense. I don't think that's something that's actionable. But I do think we need somebody who is charismatic, that can speak in public, that is funny. I think an underrated part of Trump's appeal, like it or not, he's funny. And so I think we need somebody who is funny, who is charismatic, who is forceful, who's untethered from the Democratic Party and can get up on that primary stage and say, you people screwed us. Donald Trump is screwing us, but you people sold us out by foisting these bad candidates on us. Now we've been out of power. All of these people have been damaged by Republican policies, and we're sick of it, And so I think, Bernie Sanders is too old, at this point is the reality, but I think we need a new charismatic leader on the left, and I tend to think we're going to get one because the demand is certainly there. So I am optimistic about 2028. I think we'll get more interesting candidates. I don't think it's going to be Gavin Newsom or one of these other suits that the Democratic Party rolls out. So I'm actually optimistic about the future. But in terms of who is the right sledgehammer, I don't know just yet. But I'll certainly vote for him.
I think Dev.
Hi, my name is Dev Rohit. I'm a senior government major. Thanks for being here. I wanted to ask, I was looking at some of your involvement in the discourse around the proposed endowment tax on Twitter.
Sure.
I found your interaction with the discussion interesting, and especially what you refer to as the bad or insane behavior of very rich colleges and universities. Help me understand, are you equating these very rich institutions to any individual in the billionaire class? Like, are they as bad as Elon Musk? Having, not necessarily as bad, or like having that concentration of wealth. Is that the issue here? Or do you think that an endowment tax, for example, or any other policy that punishes these universities for concentrating that wealth, do you think that's going to get to your earlier point of political neutrality or recentering these universities? Help me understand the goal of that.
Well, the goal of the endowment tax is to make universities pay their fair share. Very elite institutions like Harvard with $55 billion endowments really exist to reproduce the elite and again, staff the offices of Google and BlackRock and so on. So the fact that they pay 1% in taxes a year is absolutely egregious, particularly when the communities surrounding many of these places are struggling. If you look at a place like Johns Hopkins University, astronomical endowment, Baltimore is very much struggling. They could use those tax dollars, they're not getting them. So part of the case for taxing endowments is that universities aren't paying their fair share. Corporations pay 21%. It's not, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say universities should too. The other issue is that, these are the places that are driving wealth inequality in the United States. That is a reality. This is a place that is driving wealth inequality in the United States. The college where I teach is a place that's driving wealth inequality in the United States. And if institutions are just going to reproduce the elite and to hand out favors to people who donate and allow the sons and daughters of rich alumni to waltz through the door and not compete fairly with anyone else, yeah, I think they should be taxed, right? The point of avoiding heavy taxes on universities is the idea that universities serve the public good. And there are ways in which that's true. Universities and scientists trained at these universities do incredible things like create vaccines that save millions of lives around the world or billions of lives, right? So these institutions produce really important work. But again, the reality is at this stage, they are mainly, reproducing the staff at Google and Wall Street, and I think the case for them not paying their fair share is ridiculous. Another thing is that universities act like endowments are monopoly money, right? I was talking to somebody at an Ivy League university who was a dean a couple weeks ago, and they were like, Trump wants to raise our endowment tax from 1% to 20% or maybe 30%. Isn't that horrible? And I was like, why should you guys not pay your share? And she said, our margins are tighter than you think, right? But you're sitting on a $50 billion endowment that you want us all to pretend is money you can't touch, right? And I just find that inexcusable. So, I think there's a moral case for an endowment tax. I think there's a community-based case for an endowment tax because many of these elite institutions, whether it is Columbia or Harvard or Yale, are in communities that are not exactly doing so hot and could use those tax dollars. Now to your question about is Harvard as bad as Elon Musk? I don't know how to equate those two things, but I do think there are centers of economic power on the left and centers of economic power on the right. On the right, you have people like Elon Musk, and now I guess Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. On the left, you have these institutions that are managing endowments the size of the GDP of many medium-sized nations, right? So I think both have corrosive impacts on American life. Their impacts are different. One is aesthetically more pleasing to me, and I'd rather get a beer with the person who manages Harvard money than I would rather get a beer with Elon Musk, but both have really corrosive impacts on American society, I think.
It's so interesting to say that because having worked in nonprofits for many decades, I remember being told by, most of what you do in nonprofits is raise money, and you often do it by telling people they can write off their donation, right? That they don't have to pay taxes on it. And I remember sitting in a room where a very experienced sort of consultant said, it's outrageous that we think that that's an appropriate thing to use to get donations, right? That actually many of us believe in taxes, believe that that's part of how you pay for the social good, and yet we are going to then say, actually to certain classes, give us money because you can then not pay as much taxes.
Yep.
That is a very interesting.
No, for sure.
All comes down to tax policy.
It does.
All right, I don't
agree.
want to. What up in the back? I know I see, but before. Okay, we've got someone I haven't seen before about to ask a question that hits both marks. I think Erica's got.
Hey, I'm Jack. I'm a senior
Nice to meet you,
psychology major. Not super well versed in the government, but been having a lot of discussions with friends and family about AI and billionaires the past couple of days. And it seems like the narrative has changed from power to the people to power versus the people, and power working in tandem with money. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like tech billionaires don't just have access to our personal information, but can track and influence our behavioral patterns through social media algorithms that capitalize on confirmation bias and polarize our perspectives to either end of a binary. Simultaneously, these chats and these Google AIs developments limit real people's answers, like Wikipedia and different forums, shifting us away from the popular input. And I think it's actually quite scary. So how do we, as humans, combat those with power? Like, what can we do in this day? And does this shift away from popular input leave us in a blind spot for brainwash and manipulation by these tech billionaires, by these AIs, where we really don't have input from in answers? Like, we could be told something, we're just going to agree to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really great question, right? And I actually think this is surprisingly one of the things we can actually do a little bit about, right? It is very hard to give up your phone or put away your smartphone or switch from a smartphone to a dumb phone, as it were, right? It becomes much easier when you do that in communities. There are a number of very wealthy private high schools and middle schools and elementary schools around this country that have gotten rid of technology in their classrooms. That means no laptops. That means no phones in school, et cetera, right? Ironically, many members of the tech elite send their kids to these kinds of schools, right? But there's no reason we can't do that in other kinds of institutions in American society too, at a grassroots level, right? There's no reason that parents can't militate in public schools for getting the phones out of schools, getting kids off social media, et cetera, right? So I think, our demand for these technologies is one thing we do have some control over, and finding ways to break the grip of that addiction, I think, is really important. But it becomes much easier if we can do that at the sort of grassroots community level with networks of people rather than just, trying to make our own little individual stands, But I also think we need politicians, and we need to elect politicians who are going after big tech vociferously, right? Most people are not on the side of the tech billionaires. Most people do not want AI at the top of the search engine. One of the reasons why AI is so egregious is no one is asking for this. No one in this room, I imagine, or at least few people in this room, are stoked that every time now they Google something, one, Google is worse. Two, you get some dumb AI response at the top of your search page, right? No one is asking for this. It is a demand that is being created out of whole cloth and then forced down our throats, right? And so we have some agency over that, and especially if we can act in groups, but also if we elect people who make that an issue. It is a winning issue to run on. One of the reasons the Harris campaign didn't is Harris is very much tight with Silicon Valley through her brother-in-law, Tony West, and through other donors, right, like the Netflix CEO. So one of the reasons why she didn't run on those kinds of things, again, is because of the influence of money in politics, right? So if we get people who are not hoping to line their pockets with tech money from Silicon Valley and who want to stick it to Silicon Valley, I think that person is going to have relatively smooth sailing to some political wins. So I think that's part of it. I think we need grassroots movements to get rid of phones in schools and office places and other kinds of spaces, but I also think we need politicians who are explicitly going after the elites, who are embracing antitrust. Lena Khan was great under the Biden administration. Somebody who's going to empower people like that, I think, can do a lot of good.
But are we in a vicious cycle where campaigns cost so much money? So that's the argument, right? Is like, well, I have to be able to take some of this money. Like if I don't take contributions, I can't actually buy the ads. I can't hire the folks. So how does that right candidate get out of that cycle?
So I point out that the Harris campaign raised and then subsequently lit on fire $1.5 billion over the course of really a summer. That money did not help them win this election. They still lost this election. Donald Trump raised less money and used less money, and yet he won because he had mastery over new media. He embraced the podcast. He went on Joe Rogan. Harris didn't want to go on Joe Rogan because Joe Rogan is a problematic figure, which I agree, but he also has the largest audience in America, outstripping cable news stations, right? So there are ways to get around the entrenchment of money in politics. I'm not saying that it'll never play a role, but there are certainly ways to embrace forms of media and to figure out how to work with the attention economy. That will help, right? And because money was not the solution to the Harris campaign. If you won a presidential race by winning the most money, Harris would be in office right now with Tim Walz, right? And that is not the reality we live in. So I think Democrats are way too beholden to the idea that the only way to win is through fundraising. You also saw this in the aftermath of the campaign. One of my favorite tweets after Harris lost was a Democratic consultant who said, I don't understand how we lost. We raised $1.5 billion and we had all the best celebrities, right? And that kind of thinking is a real brainworm in the Democratic Party, and it's not winning elections, right? The right has that figured out. So I don't disagree with you. I don't think it's a small problem, and I don't think it's easy. But I also think the stranglehold or the utility of money in politics, I think is the utility isn't as high as it used to be. And I think other forms of new media, which are cheap, are punching way above their weight class.
Great. SK, you had something?
Hello. Hi, I'm SK, sophomore.
SK.
I have questions on politics and economy.
Please.
I'm interested that you guys were talking about Bernie Sanders, and he's been really vocal about his opinion that we are moving towards an oligarchy and with proliferation of oligarchs. Same with an economy perspective too. We are a market is moving more and more towards an oligopoly with the concentration of the market power and political power in few individuals. Sometimes it's the same people in both. So how much are we on the spectrum? Is America moving towards an oligarchy, and if so, like how much, and what are the implications of the same in both politics and economy?
Yeah, I mean, the implications are obviously not good, but I don't think we should despair. This is not the first time in American history when we've had massive concentrations of wealth. We also had that during the Gilded Age, and it was met with resistance from working class Americans and organized labor and reform campaigns that finally were able to turn the ship around and lead to a 20th century that was defined largely, particularly in the post-war period, by American prosperity. So, I think it is just a fact that we are moving into an increasingly oligarchic kind of realm. But I also don't think that means there's nothing to be done. To me, one of the crucial questions of this century, at least this decade, is who is the professional managerial class going to side with? The sort of credentialed elite that we are all a part of. Are we going to side with the billionaires, or are we going to side with the working class? The big problem right now among people like you and I is that many of us feel like we have more cultural affinities with Mark Cuban than we do feel like we have a guy who voted for Trump and is tending bar at some place in Ohio and flipping burgers, right? And culturally, that might be true. Maybe I have more to talk with Mark Cuban about than I do with that guy flipping burgers at a bar who voted for Trump in Ohio. But economically, I sure as hell have a lot more in common with the former than the latter. And I will bet everyone in this room, no matter how wealthy, is much closer on the spectrum to a McDonald's worker or much closer on the spectrum to someone tending bar than they are to Mark Cuban, right? And so part of the question is the professional class needs to develop some degree of class consciousness and recognize that our jobs are also getting more precarious. If you look at professorships, tenured professorships have fallen off a cliff over the last decade, right? It is a vanishing kind of employment, right? Law jobs are harder to come by and they're paying less. Doctors are having a harder and harder time paying off their loans. These were once stalwart professions in the professional class, which guaranteed the ability to buy a house and have a respectable middle upper class income, and that is all evaporating, right? So I think those of us in our particular class stratum should read the tea leaves and say we can side with the Mark Cubans and Elon Musks, or we can side with the people flipping burgers. And I think if we're smart, we're going to side with the people flipping burgers. We need a working class movement that includes the professional class, who is aware of their class interests and realize that Mark Cuban is not on their team. So that's sort of how I think about the moment we're in.
Okay, Lami, and then Audrey. We'll get those two. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lami, and I'm a freshman majoring in government and philosophy. So my question is, how much did you think the Supreme Court decision, Citizen United v. FEC in 2010 contribute to the growing influence of billionaires in government, especially relating to national elections and super PACs? And do you think there's a way for us to turn things around and bring this case back to the table through legislative actions?
Yeah, this will be a quick answer. The answer is yes and yes. I absolutely think that decision has had a profound impact on American politics and American life, but I also think it's susceptible to congressional remedy. One of the pieces of proof that billionaires have way too much influence on American politics is that there has not been legislation about this. Americans overwhelmingly want money out of politics. And this is what I mean when I say many Americans don't feel like democracy is responsive to their needs and concerns. Getting money out of politics is one of the most popular issues in America today. It's one of the most bipartisan issues, and yet there's no movement on it. Why? Because the people who fund campaigns on both the left and right don't want any movement on it, right? So again, this gets back to this question of we need different elected officials. We need a kind of a left liberal Tea Party, I think, who is going to be less beholden to moneyed interest and who is going to make a push for these kinds of policies because they are popular. One thing I will point out is that there has been, particularly over the last few months, an effort to say the Democratic Party moved too far left. They're not, they're not moderate enough. We need to moderate. That might be true on certain cultural issues. But if you look at economic issues that are popular today, a $20 minimum wage, free public college, health care for all, right? These are very popular positions. Regulating the banks is a popular position. 50% of conservatives think there should be better bank regulations, right? These are policies you can win on, but again, because of pressure from the donor class, those are policies that Democratic politicians haven't really run on. So, I think the good news is that getting money out of politics is popular. Some of these other issues that I think will help more Americans prosper are also popular. We just need politicians who are willing to do the popular things, and we haven't had those for a while.
Great. Aubrey? I don't know who's closer.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Aubrey. I'm a sophomore here studying government. You brought up a couple times tonight that we're in a new Gilded Age, kind of. And I noticed that, after the Gilded Age, about 30 years later, you hit the Great Depression.
Sure, yeah.
I'm wondering what you think comes next from here.
Very astute historical observation. That's very possible. One of the concerns I have is that I think AI is probably a bubble that is going to crash hard. We have been told since ChatGPT came on the scene in November of 2022 or 2023, I think 2022, we have been told that, within a year, all of these jobs are going to be gone because the machine is going to be so amazing it's going to replace workers. None of that has happened. Many of us barely use it for anything other than writing college essays. I'm sure none of you do that, as we've discussed. But I don't think these wonder machines, are nearly as miraculous as they say. They're fancy parrots that are able to reproduce the appearance of human language, but they're not intelligent in any way. The wager that AI companies are making is that intelligence is just data at scale. That means that if you just feed more and more and more data into these machines, that magically one day out of nowhere, the lights will flick on and they will become intelligent. That is literally science fiction bullshit. That is not going to happen, right? There is no case to make that magically, if you just throw enough data at these things, suddenly they're going to become hyper-aware, super intelligent, and then solve all of our problems, right? So I say that in the service of saying I think we are sitting on a bubble related to AI. I think mitigating that bubble is really important. That's not to say it has no positive use cases like cancer imaging and so on. They definitely do. But I think that's a real issue, And so I don't think we're careening immediately in the near term toward a next Great Depression, but I think we need to be very careful about AI and Bitcoin because I think both of those are things that could plunge us off a cliff very easily,
Hi, my name is Ismail. I'm a senior. Excuse me. Somebody earlier asked about kind of oil tycoons and how they influence the politics in the U.S. I kind of wanted to zoom out a little bit more and kind of look at how petrostates and how they influence kind of the climate action at a global level. I mean, most recently, we saw Azerbaijan host COP29, and everybody has their own sentiments about how that went and everything like that. So kind of what role will petrostates hold in kind of the fight against climate change, and how is as Americans can we kind of fight their influence despite them, kind of being on a foreign stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just need to have more rhetoric around this particular problem. I think we need to have more, American presidents and politicians don't want to talk about energy prices. They get very skittish talking about issues like climate change, right? Because they're worried that people are going to think it's going to hurt them at the pump and it's going to make them unpopular, But I do think we need to have a more frank conversation that is reality-based about the future we are facing, right? the public can be sold on hard things, right? You know, Donald Trump and Elon Musk have made this case to the public. That's the case they're making right now. It is a bad case, and I think it's a load of BS, but the case they're making now is you're going to suffer in the short term. We're going to gut the federal bureaucracy. We're going to roll back regulations. We're going to, maybe we'll abolish the federal income tax, et cetera. It's going to be painful for now. It's going to cause economic turmoil, but believe us, we're going to come out the other end. And a lot of Americans believe that, right? And again, I don't think that's true. But my point is, I think we need to be able to have a frank conversation about our future is going to look very different in 10 or 20 years if we can't get things under control. We're careening toward a future in which the Earth is not uninhabitable. I think some prognostications about climate change are far too dire. Climate change is not, as somebody who is an expert on human extinction, is not a threat to the human species. But it will cause massive global suffering around the world, right? And I think politicians who are willing to talk about that frankly and have a conversation about requiring sacrifices in the short term to get to a better long term, I think that's important. And then, you know, talking about the promise of jobs, right? That there are opportunities to build American manufacturing that is clean and to build jobs in a clean energy sector that doesn't just mean everyone is going to be poorer. And so, you know, combating those petrostates, I think that is, you know, it's going to involve frank conversations about, yeah, gas is going to be less expensive, but, you know, as Americans, this is something we need to do and we can do it. You know, I think our leaders are way too pessimistic about the people of our country. There have been times in history when people have made sacrifices for what they perceive to be the greater good, and I think framed in those terms in ways that are realistic, sober, and honest, I think, you know, I think that's possible. But, you know, sooner or later we're going to hit a crunch point where I think, you know, something's going to have to give. I mean, huge swaths of the United States are verging on uninsurable at this point, right? That is, you know, that's not a sustainable status quo. Eventually, people are going to start, you know, they're going to get restless, and I think we'll see change then.
We have time for, I think, 2 more. We'll take these 2.
Hi, I'm Rhea. I'm a freshman majoring in government and environmental policy. I think all evening we've talked about billionaires and how wealth inequality decides who gets to be in the room. And we've also been talking about elected officials versus unelected officials and how that affects democracy.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things we're seeing right now is this extension of power to an unelected official in the White House, Elon Musk. Do you think this is coalescing corporate interests with politics, or do you think it's one of the real solutions to solving our existential crisis right now?
Yeah, I think you're raising a really good point, right? This tension between the sense that unelected bureaucrats are running our country and making decisions in ways that are not necessarily consonant with the wishes of the American people does exist in tension with the fact that, you know, I am a Bernie Sanders, so a vaguely socialist Democrat. I think government is good and does good things, and that includes unelected members of the government, right? But I think there is this tension between a very reasonable sense that, you know, these people I didn't vote for are running the things and taking the country in a direction I don't like, and the reality that those unelected bureaucrats are really crucial in things like the fight against climate change and possess critical institutional knowledge that, you know, many public servants are in public service for decades, right? In many ways, they know more and are better equipped to make real change than people we do elect to office. So it's certainly a balance there. But I think we need more frank conversations about what the government does and what the government does well, right? USPS is a miracle. Our mail gets delivered on time. It's remarkable. It's not perfect, but it's an amazing public service. You know, there's a lot that the government does really well. We tend not to focus on that. And I think Democrats are often too cowed by Republican assaults on bureaucracy that they don't want to defend the really good things government does. They don't want to defend the people that are working in the Veteran Affairs Administration that do great work every day, right? So, you know, I think there's a real balance. I think there are legitimate concerns about, you know, as I mentioned with Biden, when, you know, a lot of unelected aides and staffers are obscuring the truth of his cognitive decline from the American people. That's a real problem. Elon Musk is running huge swaths of the White House. That is a profound problem, right? But there needs to be some kind of balance because, you know, federal workers are important. They do great things and they help keep our country running. And so that's a real balance. And you're right. It's particularly important regarding things like climate change, where you need people who are long-term employees and technical experts, right, to help that fight.
Great. One last question. And then we've got rapid fire.
Oh, awesome.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for being here again. Really appreciate it. My name is Joe. I'm a senior government major. And I'm trying to phrase a question at like a little bit of a kind of, I think just a tricky thing I'm trying to understand from what you've been saying is like the Trump and Vance, you know, in their candidacy, they did really well getting into these media spaces where our attention is right now and where as a lot of us, we're having to make tough decisions of how do we spend our time and
Yeah.
where do we get our news. But I think that also you're making the argument that we should get away from that, we should take phones away, which I totally agree with and I'm really on board with. But I think it's for the Democratic Party and then also for people like us that are young and trying to figure out where to spend our time and where to kind of buy into that attention economy. Like, where is that confluence going to come in the next 5 years and then also maybe in the next 20 of like where can we move towards getting news and getting messages from politicians that's impactful and effective, but also not getting caught up in that, because I think that it's it's really dangerous if we kind of go deep too into that. And we've seen that if we get in our own little rabbit holes, we don't hear the other side, and we've seen the power that has and all the hate that brings.
Yeah, I think, I don't think it has to be an either or, right? I mean, there are really great things that new media does in terms of elevating voices who don't have institutional power connections, that have interesting perspectives to bring on important issues. There's a danger when all of our news sources are coming from new media, very obviously, right? There are things that the New York Times or the Atlantic or the Washington Post can do that those kinds of outlets can't. They have the resources to send people who are like me to places to talk to people in person, to do investigative reporting, right? That is extremely resource intensive, and you need the backing of these kinds of institutions to make that remotely workable, right? So I think we need a balance, right? And it's not just a matter of saying, down with the New York Times and the Washington Post, and we're just going to embrace new media fully, because there's a lot of things new media can't do. But what new media does do is bring really important balance to those sort of deeper and more institutionalized parts of our media environment that do important work in some areas, but also have real profound blind spots in other areas, and have their own sorts of class biases and political biases as well. So I don't think we have to make a choice either or. I do think it's important to, one thing I feel strongly about in terms of, in the service of wrapping up, in terms of your question about how do we think about spending our time, I think you should be spending your time in spaces that are politically contested, media spaces that are politically contested, in which you hear a range of views. I think the idea that liberals should retreat to blue sky is horrifying, right? The idea that we should retreat to a bubble in which everyone agrees with us and we never have to argue and we just hear nice, pleasant things all the time, that is not thinking. That is the evacuation of thought entirely. Twitter is a noxious website. I'm not suggesting that anyone should be on it. But the one virtue it has is that there are people fighting about politics where you're exposed to different ideas across the class stratum and across the political spectrum. There are podcasts that do the same thing. Ezra Klein is certainly in the sort of institutional model, and his politics are not mine. I'm much further to the left than Ezra Klein, but Ezra Klein does an amazing job of having people from all over the political spectrum on his show, talking to people on the quote-unquote far right, talking to people, Bernie Sanders Democrats, et cetera. So I would focus on, and you know what, in Joe Rogan's defense, Joe Rogan does this too. Joe Rogan has Marxists on his podcast, he has left-leaning people on his podcast, he has people from all over the political spectrum, right? So listening to those kind of sources, taking them with a grain of salt, realizing that new media does not have the fact-checking or the resources to put into reporting that other kinds of media institutions do. But they also, they do things that those legacy institutions can't. So I don't think it's an either-or, but it's sort of a both-and situation. But absolutely, I would encourage you, if you are listening to new media that is very politically siloed, I don't think that's good for you. I don't think that's good for politics. And so do your best to engage with the diversity of voices. It's not going to hurt you. It'll only help.
Okay, I'm going to break my rule of never going over because I'm so excited about the rapid fire. Go, Jocelyn, go.
Should we eat the rich?
We should not eat the rich literally, but metaphorically, absolutely, yes. They probably taste bad is why.
Will Trump get a third term?
Absolutely not. I think there are a lot of Republicans in power, a lot of Republicans who have presidential aspirations of their own, who are not just going to roll over and let Trump have a third term. They're going to want their turn at the wheel. So no, I don't think Trump will have a third term.
What's the most important class to take in college?
American history. I think what history does, this is a very cliched answer, but what history does is tell us that at times American life and society has been different. Sometimes it's been better, sometimes it's been worse, but it can be different. And in a moment when people want different things, I think it's good to be reminded of periods in time where things happen in different ways.
If you had to pick one comedian to run for president, who would it be?
Bill Burr.
All right. With that, I want to thank you for an extraordinary conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
it's
you
really
so
fun.
much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. We'll see you next week for Chris Scalia. Have a great night.